All right, then, welcome back to another episode of Odd Brains, where we illuminate the ideas shaping our world. I'm Isaac Walker, joined today by my insightful co host, Varum the Sound. Today, we're diving into a hot topic that's been buzzing across social media: the recent TikTok ban and its far reaching implications. We're thrilled to have a special guest with us, Quinn Que. Quinn is a cultural commentator and social media manager with a keen eye on the trends and dynamics of the digital world. His expertise will shed light on what this ban means for content creators, consumers, and the broader social media landscape. So sit back, relax, and join us as we unpack the ripple effects of the TikTok ban with Quinn Que, right here on Odd Brains. Welcome to the show, Quinn.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, no problem. Thank you for coming. So, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Absolutely. So I am Quinn Que. I am a multimedia writer and cultural commentator. I have a background in social media management. I have studied TikTok as well as other social platforms over the years, mostly related to maximizing their utility for brands that I work with and seeing how to best engage with them and how other people are engaging with them. So I think it'll be a very fruitful discussion for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, it's definitely one I want to get into. So let's get into it, man. What's going on with TikTok? Why is it banned?
So as of May, so literally as of this month when we're recording, President Biden has signed the legislation known as the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, or PAFACA, an act of Congress that's passed both houses. That's why it came to the president's desk, uh, which would require a ban or divestment, which is an important distinction, of the TikTok platform related to its connections to Chinese entities, specifically its ownership stake from Beijing-based ByteDance Ltd. So TikTok Ltd. Or TikTok Limited, the company in the U.S., is owned by a Beijing, China-based firm known as ByteDance, and this new act from Congress would demand that it be banned in its current form, banned from operating in the US in its current form, or divested from ByteDance so that a non-Chinese entity became the primary had the sole ownership stake. So I believe their ownership stake currently is mixed. ByteDance accounts for some, not all of it, but ByteDance would not be allowed to own it if this act is taken to its logical conclusion, which I believe will be in January 19th of next year, unless, and we'll get to this down the line, unless legal challenges stall that.
Shout out to our sponsor, Bad Product, the modern lifestyle brand that specializes in streetwear apparel and accessories. Their dedication to values such as self-care promote an optimistic vibe that is sure to spread awareness, and we are always happy to endorse a small business that ultimately shares common beliefs. Go check out Bad Product for yourselves. They stay with multiple collections, great deals, and specials. Simply use our coupon code VAGABARD for 10% off your final purchase. For the best quality, choose the Bad Product. We appreciate the support, and without further ado, please do stay tuned and enjoy the show.
So, has this ever happened before? Has there ever been something similar where they've asked a company to divest?
Asked is a very important choice of words. And so the answer is yes. Notably in 2020, the dating app, that might be a generous choice of words, but the dating app Grindr, targeted for gay men, was owned by the Chinese-based Kunlun investment firm, and they had a 60% stake, I believe, with some reluctance due to being sort of pressured and heavily negotiated behind the scenes with government agencies, national security committees from Congress, etc. They ultimately came to divest their stake in Grindr, so that Grindr could continue to operate in the United States, separate from Chinese involvement. And so yes, there has been some precedent for it. Notably, that was not through an act of Congress. That was more through negotiations behind the scenes. In this case, this act is somewhat of a new push because it's going to require, well, it's already been signed and agreed upon by the government, but it's going to require TikTok Ltd to either fight it, as they've indicated they will, or agree to it, which may still happen, but they've so far signaled that they won't.
Can I ask real quick, what does this mean though in regard to our free speech? I mean, obviously that's a major concern. That's like,
sure,
some would say the first concern. Does this not impose on free speech at all?
So free speech scholars are somewhat skeptical, but also somewhat mixed. Legal scholars in general are mixed on the act and how it will survive legal challenge from TikTok. TikTok has filed suit, so they're taking it to court. It's difficult to say. On the one hand, the way the act is phrased, and as with anything, the language of the law is going to be the primary sticking point in any legal challenge. The way it's phrased, it says including, things like including or such as TikTok. It doesn't technically say only TikTok. So the law can be interpreted as applying to all social media platforms. For example, it just so happens that most of our social media platforms don't have heavy investment from Chinese entities. So in that regard, one could say that it's not an infringement that is unduly focused on one entity per se. As far as the free speech implications, technically one could say the government has a role in maintaining national security interests. That's why the act ultimately passed, is on national security grounds. And the challenge will be for the government to prove that there is a national security threat from TikTok and the Chinese entities that are involved with it. It's going to be a challenge. I'm not a legal expert, but I would say it could go either way in court. And TikTok Ltd does want it to be fast tracked, so they are already in the District of Columbia court and looking for Court of Appeals and willing, it seems from their indications, to take it all the way to the U.S. Federal Supreme Court if need be.
Okay, can I follow up on that real quick? Is because what I like some of what I'm hearing, like it's a national security response. And like that's where their argument comes from. And China's obviously a major rival, but like how is this a national security threat?
Okay, so
and furthermore,
sure,
I'm sure data has something to do with it. So with this, like especially in regard to our data.
Okay, so there's two facets to the answer to that question. The first is that the actual structure, the actual corporate structure of TikTok is a bit complex and highly international, but suffice to say, ByteDance is based in Beijing, so it's based in China, and it is subject to various government policies of the Communist Chinese Party, the ruling government of China, including a recently passed Chinese export law or policy. I forget the exact terminology of it, but something that stipulates that Chinese tied or Chinese based corporations, tech companies, cannot divest or otherwise give out sensitive information that is proprietary to them and which the Chinese government by default has access to. One of the key things to consider here is that the Chinese government, per their national security and intelligence policies, has access to servers, data, etc., of companies that are based in China, do business in China, are connected to China in some way, and that includes ByteDance and TikTok. So a concern that people have brought up is that the data of US users could be accessed by the CCP. And there's already been indications that ByteDance and its servers have been accessed in China. It is not explicitly clear if the CCP has asked or been given direct access to user data, but the possibility is there. And that in itself has been seen as a national security risk. I hope that answers your question, but if not,
yeah, it does. And then because the what comes to mind is I remember, and then I don't remember how to pronounce his name though. Zi, the guy that's been in Congress.
Xiao Zhiqiu, yeah.
Xiao Zhiqiu. I am not attached or affiliated with the CCP. He kept
yes,
repeating because it's important to notate that what and I don't want to get too far deep in here, but like what communism is, and in their country, the government is very invested in corporations and business and things of that nature, and they have control over the economy. We have a free market, whereas they do not. And so for an American to have suspicions, of a Chinese company in our free market, I suppose the argument is that they have fair play there.
Right. So it is important to note, again, as part of the complex, international structure of the company, Xiao Zhiqiu is a Singaporean, I believe Singaporean American, but definitely a Singaporean. So he's not a Chinese national, as he repeatedly stated, and he does not have, connections to the Chinese government. However, ByteDance as a company and many TikTok employees are actually based in China and do interact with Chinese entities because, again, the Chinese government kind of has their hands in various pies throughout the country. And basically anything that goes on in China, one can assume Chinese government has some knowledge of or access to. There is actually some concern that he may have given testimony that, if not literally perjurious, was at the very least misleading, because he made it sound like TikTok has never provided any data to Chinese entities. But later reports from Forbes and the New York Times indicate that, again, because of ByteDance's Beijing basis and the fact that many TikTok Ltd and ByteDance employees do work in or move in and out of China, it's more likely that some amount of user data was accessible, if not directly accessed, by the CCP. So,
right, just under the definition of what communism is, it's like, how could it not? Essentially, yeah.
The way they run their country, like
right.
It's important to remember that the CCP in its current state runs more of a mixed economy, that it does include somewhat more capitalistic entities. That's how they're able to do business, how they're able to do exports and have a role in the international stage. It's not all like straight communism per se, with the means of production being controlled by the government at all levels. But everybody basically, to make it sort of like simple, there's a phrase in U.S. government of I serve at the pleasure of the president. So like military generals and whatnot will say I serve at the pleasure of the president. Members of staff, the executive branch will say I serve at the pleasure of the president. The president can hire and fire any members of the executive branch and usually has some authority over certainly like almost heavy authority over international affairs and some heavy authority over the military commander in chief. So in that regard, that all makes sense. That's all government. In China, it's like we serve at the pleasure of the party. So even if you're just like a guy who's making widgets in a factory and selling them to companies that want to build things internationally, in a sense, you serve at the pleasure of the CCP. They're giving you the right or the freedom to operate that way, but they can revoke it at any time. Famously, Jack Ma, who was a big time investor, kind of like Chinese Mark Cuban, if you will, was running afoul of the CCP at one point, and they sort of made him pay for that, it seems.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's some important context for sure.
All right, so I want to ask about the implications of what our data means to these tech companies, and what is the fear that China could do with our data?
Sure. So the primary concern with data in tech and data in social media in general is that tech companies, because of the way that their rights agreements that they make us all sign when we sign up for these platforms, like if you sign up for a Google account, if you sign up for a Facebook account, if you sign up for Twitter or X account, you have to like read through and agree to this very extensive contract, which unfortunately nobody does read, but you should.
I don't.
Yeah, exactly, but you should. I will admit I have not in the past either with some platforms. I've become much more of a stickler on that, but even so, to some extent, we feel compelled to operate on these platforms. So we feel compelled to just kind of give it up to some extent. But those agreements give them the authority and the access to wide swaths of data on us, things like our physical location via our GPS on our phones and other devices, things like our name, such that we are willing to disclose it and willing to, in some cases, verify it. There's now verification protocols on certain platforms that you can opt into just as a civilian, not even being a celebrity. There's photos, there's any number of things that we just freely put up or give up to these platforms. And while there's already a lot of concern about data and tech on the domestic side, like Facebook knows too much about us, or Meta knows too much about us, Google, Alphabet knows too much about us, and it's true, they do. On some level, the worst one would argue is that they would use that to like market us more. They would use that to sell us stuff. It's a little uncomfortable, a little skeevy, but it's not as potentially threatening as the Chinese side of it, where one could argue a foreign entity that is in, one would say, a Cold War with the US might use data on US citizens to facilitate their pushes to win or otherwise get an edge in that Cold War. For example, if you knew the likes, dislikes, locations, etc., of various citizens, millions, hundreds of millions of them at any given time, what could you do with that beyond just selling them a new watch, say, if you were let's say, interested and not exactly positively aligned party?
Yeah, this whole talk about data and what these corporations can do with that data, this has been a conversation that's been going on for a long time. And, I feel like, maybe now that we're talking about what China could do with it, maybe we'll start asking questions and say, hey, what's X and Meta and, Microsoft, what are they going to do with our data? How do we rein them in? Do you see that conversation finally starting to take place and maybe actions starting to happen to rein in these other tech companies?
I mean, to some extent, it's been happening for years, if not decades already. So, to some extent, the answer is yes, but to some extent, the answer is no, because the amount of progress we've seen in that regard has been limited. Regulation to sort of rein in tech companies rein in domestic tech companies has been talked about, and there's been hearings about them. Notably, people will probably remember when Zuckerberg and others were brought before Congress multiple times, actually. But the end result of that seems to be more grandstanding by politicians and finger wagging and shame, but not a lot of actual tangible legislation. It's actually somewhat surprising that the TikTok legislation went as far as it did and was ultimately signed, because it could theoretically have not been. But I think once they all looked at the foreign enemy and national security aspects, they all kind of got on the same side, as well as they had a kind of a an easier enemy to fight. Whereas if you're trying to police a domestic company with its own lobbyists, its own knowledge of the system, and its own enfranchised users, it's a little bit harder to say, hey, we're actually going to regulate you now. Well, my money says you're not.
Yeah. So is it? Well, we about to say something, Vern?
No, I was just agreeing. Yeah, I was just agreeing. It's such a popular platform, like I don't know. And around that comes a lot of conspiracies. So yeah, it's just I agree for sure.
Yeah, it is a popular platform, and my question is, why don't the other companies like Meta, why don't they just outcompete TikTok? I don't understand why TikTok is eating Meta's lunch.
Right.
They're billion-dollar companies. A lot of these social media apps, they seem to mimic each other. Like before we started this interview, we were talking about Clubhouse and how Twitter has spaces now.
Yeah.
And basically, Clubhouse is defunct. So my thing is, why doesn't Instagram and Facebook just mimic TikTok? What is it that TikTok is doing that is just killing all the other social media companies?
So there's a few things with their secret sauce, which is proprietary, and that's another thing that ByteDance has said in their legal filing. Because it is proprietary, because the CCP would not want it to be released to a domestic entity, a domestic owner, they feel they can't sell. That's one of their reasons. The algorithm, as such, is actually very good on TikTok at doing a few key things. Firstly, it's very good at finding smaller accounts and allowing them to go viral. Now, what goes viral is a matter of discussion and debates, and there's also been some talk about whether or not there's people who are putting their thumb on the scales with particular content versus other content. The way that there's been some talk about the way that TikTok functions in the US versus the way that it functions in China, because it's based off of a Chinese app called Douyin. How Douyin is different is also a point of contention. But basically, in the US especially, you can go viral very easily with TikTok. And when you go viral, in the same way as, let's say, in the past with a viral short on Vines, if people can remember, or Vine, if people can remember Vine, or a viral YouTube video. When you go viral, it doesn't just go viral on the platform, it does, but it tends to go out into the larger internet ether, and it becomes like a talking point even on the news. The amount of people that are on the platform, which is a function of popularity and marketing and sort of a snowball effect where people see oh, I can post a funny dance video and then show up on, ABC News or whatever. It makes more people want to get onto the platform, see what's happening next. Maybe they'll be the next person who gets magically chosen by the algorithm and gets their 15 minutes of fame. So that, I think, is driving a lot of engagement, as well as just people feeling like it has a very it's combined a lot of useful things that existed on other platforms, but in a new package that they like more. So, for example, there's a tool on TikTok where you can combine videos, thread them together, and make new videos. It's similar to a feature that Tumblr had for their text-based threads, where one person could make a thread, and then another person could tag onto that thread, and before you knew it, you had a big collage. On TikTok, you can do that with videos, where you have a big collage of videos that tell a whole story. There was famously an example of a guy who showed a video a reveal of his girlfriend, and then someone else turned that. Yeah, you've probably seen it. And
yeah,
then someone else
that,
turned that into basically a hostage situation. This is my girlfriend, but then it looks like he's holding a ransom because he didn't look in the original video. He looked kind of nonplussed about the whole thing. And then it's hey, hey, we the police are knocking on the door. We see you. Just let her go, and it became this whole big funny thing that can only happen on TikTok. There's other things that other platforms like Meta have tried to do, like Instagram Reels, but it hasn't really hit in the same way. YouTube Shorts, similarly, and video now is more of a thing on X, especially for those who have subscribed to the premium service, which you have to pay for. You can now not only upload videos, but upload long form videos, almost as long as YouTube videos in some cases, or even longer. But for a lot of people, they don't go to those platforms for those things, or they're just so not used to engaging with those platforms as like the thing because they're not as new or shiny, that I think they're struggling to rebrand themselves as being on equal footing in that same way, if that makes sense.
I gotcha. One thing too I've noticed is the TikTok store, where if somebody is talking about, like, I don't know, a dress or something like that, someone can just click a button and it pops up and there's a dress right there, and someone can buy it in the app.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on Instagram, as far as I know, if you want to buy something, it takes you to another website, and then you gotta enter in your credit card information and things like that. I hear that the TikTok shop has been like phenomenal in terms of creating revenue.
So for sure, like in general, the idea of an everything app is something that a lot of platforms want to have. It's something that Facebook has to some extent. Facebook and Meta have to some extent via like Facebook Marketplace, and now Facebook Dating even. The idea of making this one app or this one like overarching entity be the place that people go for everything. I mean, that's to some extent what Google does with their ecosystem and what Apple does with their ecosystem. You go there for search, you go there for maps, you go there for whatever, email. And so, yeah, the ability for people to stay on platform and just engage with content or consumerism in that way is very attractive. I would say, again, it's also just like the newness factor. Just go to back to the newness factor. I think what's driving most of it is just TikTok feels like new and edgy, and even the fact that some people are pushing back on it because of the Chinese association is probably driving, ironically, some of the engagement. People feel like, oh, TikTok is like the place to be, whereas Facebook is for old people. So I think to some extent it's just like the brand identity feeding into itself as much as anything else.
This ties into something like a different topic I've discussed, and I saw a video about it as well, about like what defines a generation and such. And like there's arguments to be made about media and about how movies have turned a certain way, and that's not the topic of our discussion. But what he did say was a good point, and it was that it's more technology based now. So like you could say that Facebook is defined more by elder millennials and Gen Xers, sometimes even boomers. And then TikTok is more younger millennials and Zoomers, and now Gen Alpha coming up. And it's almost like that's where they're attaching their generational identity, And I think that when you come to talk about banning it, and when there's those kinds of implications added into it, it's really, it feels like a storm is brewing, I think. We can talk about what's happening and the fact of the matter, but how it feels is it really feels like something that like a shitstorm is about to happen, and which is very strange, because the next point that I wanted to talk about was the fact that it's so bipartisan, which nothing is bipartisan. And this is, of all things, this is. And so with those two kind of points in the same sentence is like, it's a little bit strange. The fact that it's such a shitstorm, yet it's bipartisan, just has really strange implications.
Well, I suppose what I would say to that is the national security factor is like a really strong rallying cry, and it's a really difficult thing to push back against, both by TikTok and by people in the government who would, be skeptical of those concerns. It's similar to the way that, and yeah, this is not the topic either, but it's similar to the way that whenever there's military, talks or military spending talks, usually the military gets what it wants in terms of budgets and various other things. It's very hard to push back on that sort of thing without sounding un-American or unpatriotic or hating the troops. And so to push back on like claims of national security concerns might get one if they were an elected official, or someone if they were outside the government even, branded as like seditious or anti-American, or just being insufficiently serious about protecting America's national interests. So it's hard to push back when those kind of terms and claims are rallied about.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm coming from, is like they're just like, we can talk about the fact of the matter, but the way it feels, it's unprecedented, right? Like it's a rallying cry because of national security, like you say. But national security for what? People dancing, people talking to each other, and people stitching their videos, like you said. That's one of the things that makes them different, is the fact that they can stitch. You know, these are what we're like, these are the things that we're doing on the platform. So how is that such a national security threat when we back, we can take a couple steps back to the data talk, but it's like, this is data of us stitching dance videos and editing them to make it look like the girlfriend doesn't want to be there. But like, let's like, to cut through the shitstorm, what's really the problem,
So to offer like to sort of steelman the government's case, let's say, the argument would be that, again, whereas we potentially give too much data to all tech companies, and we could have a conversation about that, when we're talking about a company that is at least partially owned by a foreign adversary, let's just put it that way, the concerns are not, again, that just you go to the TikTok shop and they can sell you something better. It's if they wanted, they being the CCP or just ByteDance acting implicitly on what they think the CCP wants, let's say, were to put their thumb on the scales of the algorithm, they could push the type of content that would be more chaotic or shitstormy on the platform itself, like pushing against, let's say, the American government, pushing against, let's say, patriotism, pushing against, let's say, social cohesion. And that would be potentially a problem, right? Like you could look at it as a kind of propaganda or a kind of campus farm for campism, like third camp, like people who like actively hate their native government, hate America, hate whatever. That would be the argument. It's packaged to look innocuous enough. We're all just doing dances and talking about whatever we want to talk about. But for example, when things go viral in a certain way here, whereas over there with Douyin, on Douyin, they would never have like terrorist apologia go viral. And you can think whatever you want about some of the stuff that's gone viral on TikTok. You think whatever you want about certain political issues, but they would never have things that went against what the government wants. And perhaps the argument be like the government is too heavy-handed. I would say that's a fair argument. The government is too heavy-handed in China, so they shouldn't have their thumb on the scale so much over there that people can't be free to criticize the government or say certain things that are, contrary to what they want. But over here, we get a media diet that's already so confused and complicated and potentially chaotic. Why have one more thing, and why have that one more thing be so enmeshed with an adversary that has an interest in it being that way? Let's say that's the argument anyway.
Yeah, and my final thought on this, and I'm gonna go ahead and make my early thesis here, is that it sounds to me like it is about free speech, and it sounds to me like if it's about free speech, it's a matter of being fair across the board. Because in China, you could argue they're a little too heavy-handed, and that they would never do that on their app. That was discussed on the Congress hearings about the kinds of content that gain more popularity, and whether or not you said there's a thumb up, there's a thumb that's dialing it up, somewhere behind closed doors. And these are things we don't know. And the fact that they call that proprietary is a little concerning. So yeah, it does come back around to, in my opinion, free speech. But the problem is that communists don't believe in free speech the same way that we do. And if they're a little heavy-handed on their own version of this app, and they're a little bit more liberal, almost in a propagandist kind of way, on our version of the app, it's almost like the best metaphor that I can think of is like when two families come together, right? And maybe they come from different cultural backgrounds, and the stepfather is a little bit more harsh on their own child and a little bit more lenient on the stepchild, because I don't care, like, that's your mother takes care of that, or whatever, and the implications are different because these aren't step parents, these are rivals. So it's very different. So my early thesis I'm talking about here is, it almost, you used the word Cold War a second ago, and it reminds me of the Cold War, but instead of a space race being the implications of nuclear bombs, we're talking about social media being the implication of influence, and influencing whole nations in the palm of their hand, a psyop in the palm of your hand, and those are heavy implications. So I can see why bipartisan support would come, rallying. And it's almost concerning that, like, on one hand, you'd be like, okay, so just say it like it is. Call a potato, whatever, like, say that these are our concerns. But when you say those concerns out loud, all of a sudden China's like, what? You don't trust us? We're like, back to the step family metaphor. It's like, what, you don't trust me? Why did I move in then? And yeah, shitstorm.
So I want to piggyback off of what Varum was saying. So what's interesting, right, is how social media does sow discord, and it's radicalizing everybody. My question is, whose fault is that? Is it the American people's fault because we're seeking out that content? Is it the American corporations for their algorithms? Or is it China? Is China just doing what the American corporations are doing? And what I think is interesting, right, is that TikTok in America and TikTok in China are very different. In China, it's more of an educational app. They put educational content towards their kids. They're not really dancing and singing from what I see. They're doing science experiments. And also, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that, like, after like 8 o'clock, children aren't even allowed on to the app. And I think that they have like a time limit. So my question is, well, I guess you can sense the question I'm asking. You know, I don't know. You get what I'm saying? Like, what's? Yeah, I kind of rambled there. I forgot
Can
the
I
question
add
I
to
was
that?
asking.
You asked
Yeah.
who's to blame, but I think the question that you might really truly kind of be digging at there is who benefits, right? That's what I want to know. Who benefits from this?
Sure. So to be clear, Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, has a 40-minute daily limit for users under 14, and they also can't use the app between 10 p.m. and 6 p.m. local time. There's other restrictions related to children, which admittedly, TikTok Ltd, CEO Chu, the Singaporean guy, he did indicate that they were looking into restrictions on the U.S. version of TikTok for minors as well. Probably not as strict as what Douyin has, but something. So there is that. But yeah, who benefits is a very good question. Like when tech companies go to other markets with their wares, they generally do try to offer the same product. Obviously, there's gradations, and in particular, when U.S. tech companies go to China, there's all kinds of things that happen, and oftentimes they end up just leaving because they find that the restrictions and the requirements, the disclosures with the CCP are just too onerous, um, as well as the fact that for as much as China on a global stage, especially these days, post 2020, has been more signaling more protectionist instincts and wanting to have their stuff be theirs and whatnot, they have had a historically rather fluid idea of copyright and ownership of ideas and property when it comes to things. Famously, um, piracy and knockoffs run rampant throughout China and Beijing. But regardless, who benefits? I would say the argument would again be China benefits from this imbalance between the way that the two versions of the app are presented and managed, as well as the discord that may be getting sowed on the domestic shores, on the U.S. Shores. And the US, for its own part, the argument, I suppose, would also just be we have enough social media platforms, quote unquote. If there's already concerns that the social media platforms, as they are, the domestic ones, are too prominent and have too much power and too much data, then the harm of creating this restriction, which again, at least in theory, if not in practice, could apply to other social media apps, social media companies, putting this restriction in place about foreign ownership and other things, it would have some benefits long term and maybe signal that we can try to police ourselves a little bit better, right? Your parenting analogy is apt. Like, it's not good to be too strict with your kids, but it's not good to be so lax with them either that they do whatever they want, and before you know it, they're getting into horrible situations that could have been avoided. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. So one thing you mentioned about how it's bipartisan support.
mm.
You know, what's interesting is recently Donald Trump has come out against the TikTok ban. What do you make of that?
So it's interesting. Yes, you're right. He announced he denounced the bill, claiming that it gave too much power to Facebook, and he did this in opposition to many of his allies. I can't call it. There's so many things that Trump does that Mr. Trump, former President Trump, does that I just find incomprehensible. So that this might be another one of them. I would say he mentioned that he feels like it would give too much power to Facebook and Meta, which I can maybe sort of see, but at the same time, my read on what would happen if the TikTok ban actually went through and TikTok went through with their threat of just closing up operations altogether rather than divesting, the user base and the power as such would be diffused across the social media space. Some would go to Instagram, some would go to TikTok, which are some would go to Instagram, some would go to Facebook, which are the same company, Meta, but still. Some of it would go to YouTube, some of it would go to X, colloquially known as Twitter. Some of it would go to, a number of other platforms. I think perhaps he's trying to signal a contrarian streak that will put him in opposition of Biden, particularly as we get closer to the presidential election. More and more, both of those two men want to signal how they are different from each other, and having himself be able to say, like, hey, I don't agree with my opponent on this ban that he signed into law, would at least be a point of distinction that could maybe get him the youth vote, one could argue. Unlikely, but maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, this is just a theory. I don't know enough about politics, but it really just seems like a grasping at straws. Like he's the kind of person that likes to be a contrarian, and I think he could give a fuck. He has his own social media platform, And
Well, actually, that's not true. True Social,
oh
the
yeah,
Yeah.
founder and lead poster with an A poster at True Social. Famously, he has not gone back to Twitter
no,
since.
that's what I meant. Is he owns
Oh, okay. So I
his
thought you
own
said he
spot now. Yeah,
didn't
yeah, yeah.
do social media. I'm sorry, I
Yes, no,
misunderstood.
no, but I understand what you're saying though. That's my point. Is like he could give a fuck about TikTok because in his head, if TikTok goes down for real, that could
Hmm.
be good for his business. So
Oh, sure, sure.
you know what I mean? So I really think that
Right,
he doesn't care either way,
right.
and that he's
He's just
saying
saying
it
stuff.
because this
Mhm.
is potentially a shit storm as well. And if it is a shit storm, well, I've been against it since the beginning, you know? I don't know.
Sure,
To me, it's
sure.
one of his. I see, like, because I never saw him as a politician. He was a businessman. He was an outsider. That's what gained him a lot of votes. That's probably one of the first real smart political moves I've seen him make.
Mhm.
Is because if it backfires in Biden's court, he gains a lot of support. It rhymes, so it's got to be true.
Perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. So here's the topic, and this is kind of a third rail. So some people say that the TikTok ban is being pushed right now, mainly because of the whole situation in Israel and Palestine. They say that they want the TikTok gone because people are seeing so many images about what's happening over there, and it's pushing people to be, to take a side in that whole thing, and that they don't want TikTok because it's pushing people to be anti-Israel.
Hmm.
What do you
Well,
make of that?
it's I can't say that it is a completely unfounded suggestion because some supporters of the legislation did specifically call out what they saw as anti-Semitism on TikTok as one of the reasons why they were a fan of the ban slash divestiture legislation. Um, what I would say is, at least on paper, again, officially, this is primarily, if not exclusively, about national security and data. Um, the idea that it's specifically about a particular political issue, and I've actually heard commentators make the point that the Israel-Palestine war, the Israel-Hamas war, it doesn't benefit China meaningfully, even though one could say that it's a distraction for the West and the US. It doesn't directly benefit China. They don't have like explicit side in that conflict, and China is not famously fan of Muslims. Again, going back to the Uyghurs, which we talked about off air. So I would say it's it's hard to call how true it is that that's driving the legislation itself, but I would say whether or not TikTok being a quote unquote hotbed for extremism or hotbed for anti-Jewish sentiment or hotbed for Hamas or whatever, whether that is true and whether or not that is something to be concerned of more broadly just by people, I think is an open question. Again, TikTok's algorithm seems to prioritize things to go viral that would be of interest to a lot of people and that might not otherwise go viral on other platforms, either because those people are like low-B quote unquote accounts that are small and haven't had a lot of exposure prior to a viral incident with a particular algorithm, or because what they're saying is unpopular and it might get shouted down by others. It seems that things that might be unpopular in some contexts do have more of a possibility of going viral on TikTok just because their algorithm is such that they look for what will get eyeballs and they're less concerned with what is appropriate as such. Yeah, it's hard to call, but I am at least skeptical of the idea that uh, the Chinese want TikTok to be, terrorism central or whatever, or anti-Semitism central. And some have mentioned like if it was if anti-Semitism was a primary concern, as some supporters of the TikTok ban have said, then they probably should have also looked at other platforms like Twitter, also known as X, because anti-Semitism does seem to be on the anti-Semitism and more just like racial separatism does seem to be on the rise on Twitter as well. I hate to say it because I am a fan of Twitter, but I have noticed a difference. And so, yeah, if we were going to police that sort of thing, we would probably want to police it more heavily and more broadly than just one platform. So, yeah, it's hard to say.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I was just agreeing. That was all.
Okay. All right, then. So here's a question. What are the chances that this app actually gets sold?
Sold? Basically nil, unless, Chew and the board of TikTok Ltd reverse on the indications they've already made with their various legal challenges and comments in the press, which seems unlikely. If nothing else, what I can say about Batman and his co-workers and the Chinese more broadly, they tend to choose their positions and stick to them, for better or worse. So they've already said that if it comes to the point where their legal challenges, their options, they exhaust all of them and the ban still goes through, if the deadline comes up and the government's like, nah, and the Supreme Court's like, nah, you gotta make a decision, they're probably just going to leave. That's what they've said. So selling, absolutely not, based on what they've said. But I suppose only time will tell. Maybe they'll pull a grinder, but it seems unlikely.
So what was the end result of the grinder situation though? They divested?
Yes. So Kunlun sold what was, I believe, a 60% stake in Grindr, and Grindr now has a mixed ownership. I haven't checked it recently, but I can double check that. I believe it's a mixed ownership that is primarily domestic U.S. with, I believe, some foreign involvement from European partners, but zero from Chinese partners for obvious reasons. Although, key person, the current CEO is James Liu, an American, must emphasize, but of Chinese ancestry, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, so let's say their legal challenges don't work, right? And January 19th, I believe, was the deadline you said. Let's say that deadline rolls around. Are they just gonna take their ball and go home?
That is what they have indicated. Yeah, they've said that if the deadline passes and the courts do not give them a stay or rule in their favor and halt the legislation, then they will close operations in the US and TikTok as such will be no more. And for what it's worth, there's also precedent on that. If you look internationally, multiple countries have already banned TikTok for various reasons. And, one can do their own research and figure out those particular specifics, but it is not unprecedented for TikTok to operate in one country and then cease operating later.
Interesting. I actually did not know that. That is actually interesting to me because I was, I'm dabbling as we're talking, and I stumbled into this article, this report. China is using the world's largest known online disinformation operation to harass Americans, a CNN review finds. This is in regard to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and how they've hired government officials in China to allegedly spread propaganda and things of that nature. And I find that interesting because, with everything that we're saying and the implications, like if I'm a bully with my ball and I'm hanging out and I'm being a bully and all of a sudden that kid's parents come out and says, you better get out of my yard or I'm going to go tell your dad. All right, I'm gonna take my ball and go home, like he just said. And if they've already pulled out of other countries, that's a metaphor that comes to mind for me. Like they're stirring shit up as long as they can and then getting out. You know what I mean? But these are just obviously thoughts coming to mind as I'm reading these, the reports that yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. The creators on TikTok, have any of them spoken out about this ban, and how do they feel?
Yes, absolutely. So there's actually another lawsuit which TikTok Ltd has um, backed up, but it was not driven. Well, at least not officially on paper, it was not driven by them. Eight creators, I can't necessarily say prominent creators, but eight creators, influencers on TikTok have filed suit over the new legislation, and they again say like this impales their free speech rights. This is unduly focused on TikTok as opposed to other platforms, et cetera, et cetera. And TikTok Ltd has basically said we agree with them, obviously, and that is pursuing concurrent to TikTok's own suit against the government. I don't know how far it will go. I would guess unless TikTok throws in significantly in terms of money, probably not as far as TikTok's own solo case, but it is proceeding right now. And I believe they're in the District of Columbia too, but I'll have to double check that.
All right, yeah. One thing that pops into my mind is, let's say they are banned, right? And their algorithm is proprietary. What's to just stop them from just forming another company and just rebranding and coming right back to the US under a different name?
So it's funny. Looking over my notes, one of the questions was, what are the precedents for this, and what will come out of it, something to that effect. And basically, what I had written down was, we already saw with the Grindr divestment that essentially the government brought the Grindr to a back room, talked sternly to them, and got the result they wanted without legislation. In this case, legislation passed, and now it's like very public and just back and forth. But it seems like the battle lines were hardened by that initial skirmish back in the latter part of the last decade and the earlier part of this decade, 2019 to 2020. So based off of that, I would say now here, what we're seeing is, if this goes through, in all likelihood, there will be a lot more hesitancy from US based entities to work with China, to make partnerships with China. Because originally, Grindr was created in the US, and then Kunlun bought in to become a majority investor owner. And I think that was also part of why they were ultimately willing. They were hesitant at first, but ultimately willing to let it go. Whereas TikTok was born out of a Chinese, excuse me, Chinese product, and then retooled for an American market. So because they own it and it is their baby, that would underscore why they are more hesitant to let it go. I would say, if that were to happen, if they were to close operations, more companies would be more hesitant to work with China going forward. As to whether or not they would come back, in theory, they could, but the argument would be the same result. If they got big enough and popular enough, then they would just get struck down. And it might become a thing of whack-a-mole where, a Chinese company pops up with a social media app. It becomes popular enough to get some traction in the market. Government brings up national security concerns, it gets banned, yada, yada. Eventually, I would say, in all likelihood, the user base, if after a few of those, let's say like 1, 2, or 3 of those go down, they might start to realize, okay, don't place bets on Chinese apps, they're going to get banned. But as of right now, it's hard to say, because the only precedent for it was Grindr, and that was slightly different, and also like 4 years ago. So it's a little up in the air.
Yeah. It is. Like we only have a few examples to kind of lead us through this, but other than that, it is unprecedented, and it's just for, I'd say, tech as a whole. with, riding on what I had said earlier about generational identity being so heavily related to technology, and now that technology has evolved to a point where, it's not just a Nokia block phone, but there's a whole culture inside of this phone. That's where social media becomes part of it. And so the generational identity is tied to social media, as I was saying before. And my point being that, like, this is a massive, unprecedented change to human history. We're coming together across the world. Talk to people in Australia, connecting people from Brazil to Russia, whatever. And this is, that phones were the only other thing that we could have that would do that kind of thing. And even phones were just invented in the last century. So it's like, my point being, everything evolving so quickly, we have to define the lines for the future generations. We have to set these precedences, and I think that it's very important that these kinds of conversations continue to happen. These conversations like we're having now, because otherwise, the politicians are going to swoop in. They're going to make all the decisions for us, and we can follow along with, blindly with whatever they're saying, and just, but it's important because we're the ones on these apps. We're the ones talking to one another. We're the ones that are spreading this information, and it's important that people remember we have a say, and it's important that people remember that our voice is louder than we might think it is. And I just think it's very important that we keep these things in mind moving forward. We are the ones setting the precedents in this chaotic time. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. So, I think I've pretty much asked, all the questions that I need to ask, and, we're kind of coming up on that hour mark. So my question to you, Quinn, is, what's the final word? Is there anything that we haven't covered about this that you want to cover? And then after that, just also let the audience know where you can be found online, and where people can go to see more of your work.
Sure. Thank you. I would agree. I think we've pretty much covered it. As far as me goes, as far as me goes, it's great English, great grammar. As far as I go, I am Quinn Que, also known as Edo Quinn. It's EDOKWIN. You'll probably find all sorts of links to this at the end of in the show notes or wherever at the end. But I am a multimedia writer and culture commentator. I write scripts for film, television, and comic books. I also write articles. I've been in SF, Gate, Socorro Public Square, and Post News. Sadly, another platform that is closing, RIP Post News. But I am always available. I always like to say, you can find me on the internet. I'm always available somewhere. I would say, if not TikTok, which I do have an account, but I don't use it, you can always find me on Twitter, aka X, because that's where I find the conversations are the fastest, and text reigns supreme. And I'm a text guy because I'm a writer.
Yeah. Awesome. All right then, man. Well, hey, this has been a great talk. Hey, I look forward to the audience getting to hear this.
Yeah, yeah. Same here, guys. Thanks for your time as well. And last thing I want to say to the audience is thank you for tuning in. We love doing this, and we want to do this more. So if you like this kind of thing, do what you can to let us know. Like, follow, just let us know that you like it, and we promise we will continue having these kinds of conversations.
That's a wrap for this episode of Bright Brains, where curiosity meets conversation. If you enjoyed the ride, make sure to follow, rate, and review the show. It helps more minds find their way here. You can keep up with me on Facebook at Bright Brains Podcast, on BlueSky at brightbrainzpod.bsky. brightbrainzpod.bsky.social, and last but certainly not least, Instagram at bright_brains_podcast. And remember, that's Bright Brains with a Z. So check me out for behind the scenes content, episode updates, and more thought-provoking discussions. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time. Keep that brain bright.